I'm going to introduce Tim Llewellyn. A lot of people are familiar with you already, Tim. He is the former chair of the Balfour Project Executive Committee, and he is still a current committee member for a lot of the different committees that we have to keep the Balfour Project going. He is also in charge of our website, so that in itself is a full-time job, isn't it, Tim? He was a BBC Middle East correspondent. He was based in Beirut as well as Nicosia. And he is also an author. For example, he has written Spirit of the Phoenix, Beirut and the Story of Lebanon, published by IB Tauris in 2010. So we're very lucky to have him joining us, and he will be introducing our speaker. And as she just said before we went live, interrogating her, but we like to think of it as a conversation, don't we, Tim? So over to you both.
Helena, welcome. I should say that I met Helena first many years ago. We are not going to say how many, when she was a very young journalist in Beirut for Reuters, and since then has become, over the years, a notable and a noted writer, researcher, writer of books, writer of articles for newspapers, writer of history of the PLO, and has covered mainly Middle Eastern matters in a variety of ways. She has founded Just World Books, which deals mainly with Palestinian and Israeli matters. And recently she founded Just World Educational. And they have just produced this book, which I think you can probably see also on Helena's back wall, which is called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And that's co-edited with Rami G. Khouri. It's a summation of a very, very lucid and instructive seminar, which they held in Washington recently. And I thoroughly recommend as a really interesting and digestible read of what Hamas is all about from five basic different viewpoints: three Palestinians who live in Europe, and two Europeans who spent a lot of time living amongst the Palestinians. So Helena, welcome. What we're going to do today, I think, is to try to cut through the rubbish that's been talked about Hamas in the past year or so, especially. We've been drowned in propaganda, we've been drowned in ignorance about Hamas. What we really want from you today, and I'm sure you'll give it to us, is what is Hamas? What does it stand for? And what do we really need to take from it in its central role, really, as the only living resistance that works in the Palestinian community? I was struck by a quote that Khaled Mashal made many years ago. Gaza is the first plot of land within the boundaries of what was Palestine to be governed by a Palestinian party unapologetically defiant to Israeli rule. Helena, can you start by sort of giving us the history, the basic story of Hamas from its eruption, if you like, during the first Intifada and perhaps a bit before that? You're muted, Helena. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think I unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, fine, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. And big thanks to the Balfour Project for hosting this discussion on what I think is a really important issue, because the issue of Hamas has become a sort of third rail in a lot of the politics and discussion of the Gaza crisis right now. There are a lot of people who are reluctant to even mention the word because it seems to distract attention from the urgent humanitarian needs, and we can come into that later. So your question basically was, what is Hamas and what is its potted history? And so Hamas was founded in 1987 at the time of the eruption of the first Intifada, which was a largely nonviolent, overwhelmingly nonviolent shaking off, that's what the word intifada means, of Israeli rule in the occupied territories. And it was founded by the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which until then had pursued mainly a kind of pietistic approach to engagement, social engagement. You know, I'm a Quaker, and we have the same kind of thing in Quakerism. There are Quakers who just want to kind of try to live a pious life. And then there are Quakers who find that, you know, based on their religious convictions, they want to engage in public life and do things like, I don't know, abolishing slavery and things like that we have done over the years. So that really resonates with me, the decision to engage in political life, which they took in December of 1987. And almost immediately they were subjected to harsh crackdowns by the Israelis. And so I'll fast forward to 1993, when the secular PLO leadership under Yasser Arafat concluded the Oslo Accords with the government of Israel, which gave birth to the PA. And because of their criticisms of the negotiating strategy of the PLO, and because the PLO got so little out of the Oslo Accords, Hamas opposed the Oslo Accords. And then I think later in 1994, there was the terrible massacre at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, when 29 Muslim worshippers in the mosque were gunned down by a US-born Israeli settler called Baruch Goldstein. And that really prompted the Hamas leadership to launch some militant and even, you know, suicide bombing, terroristic attacks against Israeli civilians, because they had offered to the Israeli government that we will not attack your civilians if you don't attack our civilians. And so after the Baruch Goldstein massacre, that happened for a number of months. It was obviously terrifying for everybody involved. But in 1996, they held the first Palestinian legislative elections, and the Hamas political leadership, and it's important to understand that Hamas has a military wing, but it's underneath the overall control of the political leadership. In 1996, and again in 2006, the political leadership said, we're going to hold back on the military actions in order to allow elections to occur. And in 1996, they did not participate in the elections, but they allowed them to go ahead. In 2006, they did participate in the elections, and they won them. And that was a real turning point, because the Israelis and the George W. Bush administration did not expect that to happen, and immediately tried to overturn the results of that election. And so hence in 2007, we had the tight siege imposed on Gaza, and that has continued for the last, I guess we're 17 years of very tight siege. So that's a potted history. I can delve more into some of the details later.
Helena, can we come back to the mid-90s and the question of suicide bombing? Because I know that's the kind of thing that sticks in people's minds, and that propagandists and people who have no good feeling towards the Palestinians will make a lot of. As you said, this was a response to a dreadful massacre in the mosque, the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, by an Israeli settler. And it did last for a limited time. But while it happened, I suppose it did set in people's minds the image of Hamas as being a terrorist organization, which is a description, of course, that its enemies like to use against it, and which to some extent sticks. Now, they didn't stick to that policy. I mean, did Hamas at some stage realize that this was not the way forward?
You know, I think that Hamas has always had a political vision and wanted to engage very carefully and based on its Islamist principles in political life and has seen the use of force as a means to do that can be judiciously turned on and turned off as necessary. And, I gave you two examples of 1996 and 2006 of the legislative elections. So actually here's the list of the 5 experts who formed the core of our book. Dr. Paola Caridi, who is an Italian specialist and journalist and writer and university professor, she was living in Jerusalem in the 2000s, I think from 2003 through 2012, which did see both phases, a phase of suicide bombings, and then the phase when the Hamas leaders decided to pull that back on that and prepare the ground for the elections and then participate in the elections. And then Dr. Jeroen Gunning, who I think teaches at King's College London, he's a Dutch researcher. He had been living in Gaza during the 1990s when he witnessed, the analogous thing in the 1990s in Gaza as he was doing his doctoral research. And both of them were very clear that, this is a tactic that is used when the Israelis turn down the appeals for immunizing civilians from both sides. If the Israeli government turns that down, and obviously then we have attacks on all kinds of Israeli attacks on Palestinian civilians, many of which, continue. Obviously now they continue in the most horrendous way, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. So I think Dr. Caridi and Dr. Gunning were, they gave us a very rich idea of how the Hamas leaders reach these decisions, that there are, 4 main constituencies in Hamas at the political level. These are the constituencies in Gaza, the West Bank, the Palestinian diaspora, and crucially also inside the Palestinian prisons. So once you get this kind of richer idea of Hamas as a political organization, I think that's important. The other important thing to note is that their view of resistance is not just military resistance, it's cultural resistance. It's resisting by, supporting widows and children and orphans. It's resistance in 100 different ways, of which the military resistance is one.
I want to hold you there, because I think it's very important that we talk about what happened in 2006. I mean, here we've had all this talk about, we've just come out in 2006 of 5 years of a really violent Israeli response to Palestinian efforts at freedom. We had a virtual war in the West Bank and East Jerusalem between 2000 and 2005, in which, in fact, Hamas didn't play as big a part as some of the other Palestinian groups in military terms. But when that all ended, broadly speaking, Hamas came out as the favorite political party of the Palestinians, all of them, not just the Gazans, but the West Bankers as well. And that's something that continues to this day, that Hamas is even more popular at the moment on the West Bank than it is inside Gaza. Now, I want to ask you to explain 2006, because I think it's very revealing that this is something that's always misdescribed in the Western media and by our politicians, or is ignored completely. Hamas won fair and free elections. Tell us what happened next.
I will tell you what happened next, but first, just in the lead up to the elections, there were intensive negotiations between the Hamas leadership, the PA leadership, the Israelis, and the George W. Bush administration that laid the ground rules for this second round of legislative elections. And it was also in the aftermath of Prime Minister Sharon's decision to pull the settlers and soldiers out of the heart of Gaza. So that was what led, in a sense, to what Khalid Mishal had been talking about, as you referred, that for the first time, there was the prospect of Palestinians starting to govern a portion of the historic land of Palestine. So the ground rules were agreed between the parties, and of course included a cessation of all violence. And, it was completely abided to. And as you said, the elections were ruled by EU and American monitoring bodies as free and fair. And then Hamas won them. So this caused a complete ruckus in here in Washington, D.C. and also in Tel Aviv. And there's an excellent piece of investigative reporting by a guy called David Rose, who published his report in, of all places, Vanity Fair, on exactly how the US and Israelis plotted to overthrow the results of that democratic election. So it involved training up, PA security forces to try to take over the Hamas administration that was starting to emerge in Gaza after the elections. I was in Gaza right after the 2006 election. I had the chance to interview Ismail Haniyeh and a lot of the other parliamentarians, both there and in the West Bank, who had been elected, including women parliamentarians. And it's important to note that, Hamas has always supported women's education and women's involvement in public life. So their policy at that time was they did not want to run the whole PA themselves. They wanted to be part of a national unity government that would be headed by somebody who was not Hamas. And the PA people, the Fatah people, absolutely turned that down. The Fatah people at this point, 2006, they've been on essentially the US payroll for 12 years by then. They've gotten very used to living off very nice cozy contracts for this, that, and the next thing. Their children all get wonderful scholarships to American universities, British universities, or whatever. They are in essence the police force for the occupation, and they don't want to share that power in any way at all. And then, as David Rose and others have documented, they tried to forestall the emergence of a national unity government of the kind that Hamas was consistently calling for, and still, by the way, still calls for. That's the governance model they continue to call for now, is to have a national unity government led not by themselves. So back in 2007, Hamas was preparing the coup. Of course, Fatah was preparing the coup. Hamas's intelligence was, everywhere. They knew what was happening, and they forestalled the coup and took over in their own name in Gaza City in 2007. And so that's when the US and Israel slapped on the very tight siege. So, yeah.
Yeah, since 2007, this siege has been increasingly squeezed to the point where at many stages, well in the past, back as far as 2014, the UN, various agencies of the UN were saying that, Gaza could hardly survive, that under the pressure, the controls, the siege, the lack of food, oil, fuel, medicine, the pressures on Hamas were just extraordinary. And yet, even throughout all this and the regular breakouts of violence in response to the Israeli attacks on Gaza, Hamas did keep trying, didn't it, to mend fences with Fatah and to make clear that it didn't see itself necessarily as being the head of the whole Palestinian Liberation Organization, with small letters, I should say. It didn't see itself as the chief unit. It was willing to compromise, but it was rejected all the time.
Yeah, so I think you've summed it up really well. And, the efforts at unification of the liberation movement writ large have continued they go back to, well, they go back a long, long way to the first Intifada, but in the current century, we've had the prisoners document, which was issued, I can't remember whether that was in 2006 or 2008, I think 2006, but that was a document by, you know, the leaders of the factions of all the major factions who are in the Israeli prisons. Of course, there were always, you know, several thousand, and now there are, you know, probably more than 20,000, maybe more, and their conditions in the prisons these days are just unspeakable, as we know. But the prisoners have always played a deeply respected role in the Palestinian national movement, because, you know, obviously the Israelis have imprisoned the people they have been able to capture and whom they see as leaders, and they are leaders still in the prisons. So the prisoners document was, you know, concluded with the leaders of all the factions in the prisons, including, crucially, Marwan Barghouti, who is a very well respected, deeply respected leader in Fatah. And he was part of this, and so were all the other factions. And of course, I think it's worth noting, you said earlier that there are kind of the two main factions in the Palestinian Liberation Movement, Fatah and Hamas. But actually, there are other, you know, important factions. And right now, Hamas and its military are in coalition with a broad range of other historic and respected Palestinian liberation movements, including the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is avowedly, you know, secular and leftist. And to me, the fact that Hamas, you know, maintains this very broad and open view to who it's eager to work with, not just restricted to, you know, members of the Sunni Muslim, like the Sunni branch of Islam, I think is really important to note. Of course, the PFLP was founded by a well-known Palestinian Christian, and Christians are an important part of the Palestinian national movement.
Yes, I wanted to come on to the religious question, but first of all, I think we should pull back a little and look at Hamas as a resistance movement. I don't think people quite understand what a resistance movement has to do. I mean, in the circumstances of Gaza, a resistance has to do many things. It has to run civil society, it has to run machinery, it has to run social services, it has to look out for traitors, for informers, for collaborators. In other words, it has to be really tough. And we know from the history of all resistance movements, even going back to, especially going back to the Second World War in France, in Poland and Italy, that resistance movements aren't full of nice guys. They're not Boy Scout operations. They have to be tough, to be ruthless. They're up against an absolutely ruthless enemy, and they've got some pretty unpleasant friends as well. Could you give us a sort of view of what is the resistance movement? What do they have to do in Gaza? And is it fair to say that, you know, Hamas goes over the top occasionally because it has to?
So in international law, the right to resist military occupation by all means necessary is, you know, deeply enshrined, as is the right of peoples to self-determination from colonial domination. So the use of military force itself is quite legitimate, but of course, all actors in a military conflict, including people who are, you know, resisting military occupation or colonial domination, should abide by international law and its ban on, you know, targeting civilians or indiscriminately involving civilians. So yes, Hamas has gone over the top. The Israelis, by the way, over the top doesn't even start to explain what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza, not just in the past year, but over, you know, many decades now, including, of course, their in the West Bank, their seizure of large amounts of land and resources from the indigenous legitimate Palestinian people there. So what does a resistance organization need to do? It needs to bolster the steadfastness and resilience of the targeted population. I think that's the first thing, which means you need a lot of basically civilian style community-based organizations. And I don't know if you or the people watching this have read this wonderful book, The Survivor, by the Vietnamese American writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, who gives a very rich picture of what it was like to be in the Viet Cong in the era of American colonial domination and extermination there. So for the Hamas people, they found themselves after 2007 in this anomalous situation of both being a resistance organization, but also having governing responsibilities, which you referred to, in terms of running the water treatment plants, fixing the roads, organizing the education system. So that I think they didn't, although, your quote from Khalid Mishal kind of said this was a wonderful thing to have this happening on Palestinian national soil, but it was also a huge burden because it kind of detracts energy and resources from the job of resistance. So
it is extraordinary,
it's kind of a two-edged.
I mean, it's been extraordinary that and at some periods since 2007, not only has it had Israel all around it and all over it, attacking it mercilessly and continuously, but it had Egypt against it. Egypt closed the borders on the Rafah border for a while, and the Hamas was accused of helping the Muslim Brotherhood during the uprising in Egypt, the Arab uprising. I mean, Hamas had enemies all round. I mean, and relations with Iran became strained, with Hezbollah became strained, with Syria became very strained. I mean, it's not an easy ride. And throughout all this, Hamas has to run a difficult internal setup under the most extreme pressure. And yet, it seems to be still the understanding here in the West, in official circles, in the mainstream media, that somehow this is a terrorist organization holding its own people to ransom. I mean, it doesn't gel with the reality on the ground, does it?
No, not at all. Of course, Hamas has been subjected to outrageous disinformation, smears, and accusations throughout its history, but particularly over the past year. And, we've had the accusation that on October 7th, during the October 7th, 2023 breakout from Gaza, that Hamas operatives beheaded 40 babies, or burned 40 babies. Like, President Biden has stated that as a fact a number of times. And people have maybe tried to tell him, look, there's no evidence for this. And there is no evidence for it. If you go to the Haaretz website, where they have the list of everybody who was killed on October 7th, there is one toddler and maybe 2 or 3 other individuals under the age of 18. There is no, record of 40 dead babies, or the accusations of mass rape. So these accusations are added on top of, all the preceding accusations that Hamas is just a terror organization. The whole discourse of terrorism acquired in the West, such power after 9/11 of 2001 that it seemed to trump everything else. And, frequently over the years, when people have tried to criticize Israeli actions, the mainstream media and leaders in the West have just said, but Hamas, and they always very frequently use this kind of Israeli diction of Hamas.
I think, I think that one of the things I noticed over the past 16 years or so of this siege is that not entirely, but usually, Hamas has been good at observing the many ceasefires with Israel, and it's nearly always been Israel who breaks the ceasefires. Not always, but nearly always. And the first big event, the first big violent event Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9 at Christmas time was a long ceasefire, which the Israelis broke, and it's a pattern they kept up. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was also is the word terrorist, and we can look back. You mentioned the Viet Cong, but if I were to mention Cyprus, Kenya, and the IRA, they're just three examples of people the British called terrorists for a long period of time, banned them from the BBC in the case of the IRA, but in the end made peace with Martin McGuinness, shook hands with the Queen. I mean, but that process doesn't seem to be happening behind the scenes at all now. There doesn't seem to be any possibility of back channels anymore between Israel and Hamas.
Well, there is actually. I mean, you know, there's Qatar and to a certain extent Egypt, but Qatar has been the main intermediary, both for Israel and for the United States when they want to communicate with Hamas. And, you know, we had just in November of last year, a very successful, it was originally a ceasefire in Gaza for 4 days. And then it was so successful that they extended it by a further 2 days and then a further 1 day. So it was 7 total days of ceasefire, in the course of which I think, you know, 120 or 130, I forget the exact number, Israeli hostages were freed by Hamas. And, you know, many times that number of Palestinian prisoners were freed by Israel. And, you know, if you think how the Hamas operatives in Gaza could organize that, it required a region-wide, Gaza-wide ceasefire in order for them to locate the prisoners, many of whom, most of the civilian prisoners were being held not by Hamas, but by actually Gaza civilians who had participated in the breakout on October 7th. So Hamas was able to locate, gather, and then hand over those hostages to the Israelis. That required a ceasefire. So, you know, right now, if the Israeli government wants to get the remaining hostages, 101 of them, many of whom maybe are already dead, but they include, most of them are military people, including some very high military officers who were taken hostage on October 7th, 2023. If the Israeli government were serious about wanting to get the hostages released, it would be a similar deal to what we saw in November of last year. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, it seems by all accounts, including, you know, everything that I read from specialists in Haaretz and Yediot Aharonot, he is not concerned about the hostages anymore. He just wants to use his military to flatten Gaza and to destroy as much of Lebanon as he can in order to transform the politics of Lebanon as well as Gaza and the West Bank. So, you know, for him now, the hostages are not an issue. But if there is to be a ceasefire, the kind of ceasefire that is required to free those hostages, then Hamas has to be, once again, seriously involved in those negotiations. Now, the complicating factor here, if you like, as compared with the other examples that you gave of like the Mau Mau in Kenya or the IRA and the Provos in Ireland, the complicating factor here is that you have this PA rump organization, which is the one that's officially recognized by, you know, the Western powers. And so the Western powers, the US and the UK government are kind of part of this attempt by Israel to divide and rule, the PA versus Hamas, rather than pushing, as people, you know, around other governments around the world are pushing for Palestinian unification, which would help the negotiation and the you know the political process that is absolutely necessary. Those processes require Palestinian unification.
I mean, yes. I mean, as far as we can see, the West is being absolutely no help at all in but we don't know what Netanyahu wants. It appears to be an ever-widening war. And this is a point, I think, at which there's thousands more questions I have. And we've only scraped the surface, although you've done it brilliantly. But we're a webinar, and we want to bring in our audience. And I'm sure there are thousands of questions piling up. We've got 20 odd minutes or so, Helena. So I'll hand back to Dee and see what we've got.
We have got loads of questions, so I'm going to try to get at least one from each of the themes, because some of them are very similar. We've got one that came in from Antoine Rafoul. He asks, are the Palestinians more unified or more polarized as a result of this genocide?
Well, that's a great question. I think without a doubt, more unified, but not in a kind of clear way, not in a clear organizational way. I mean, you know, Palestinians around the world are just so like devastated by, this is the first live streamed genocide in world history, you know, and I mean, the Israeli military are sharing images of what they're doing gleefully. You know, at least the Nazis had, you know, a sense of shame about what they were doing in the extermination camps, and they surrounded their extermination camps with high walls so that people wouldn't see what they were doing. But so this is devastating for obviously Palestinians everywhere. I don't need to tell you, Dee, about this, but thus far the effect has been just kind of digging in, like, we will oppose the Israeli, US, UK, Western attempt to exterminate this portion of the Palestinian people in any way that we can. And Tim referred earlier to the fact that Hamas retains or has won a lot of support in the West Bank, and that continues. And definitely in the near diaspora, if you like, all the areas where there are refugee camps outside of historic Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan in particular, a huge amount of support for Hamas. But it's difficult to know what to do with that. Obviously, Jordan has a majority of Palestinian citizens, and you see huge marches in Jordan. Not quite as huge as the marches in Yemen, but that's a completely different
Can I just break in there a second? A question flashed up, which I think we ought to answer. And I meant to ask it to you, but it got, you know, pushed aside. Sorry, Dee, but I think this is very vital because a lot of emphasis is put on, especially by the Israelis and by our own politicians, on the charter, the Hamas charter. Does it call for the extermination of all Jews from Israel, pushing them into the sea, all that kind of thing? Could you quickly go through that point? I think it's important.
We've got a question from Lynn McAllister and another one from Michael Reed, both asking about this, because it's often when people are speaking negatively about Hamas, this is often what they raise. So yes, if you could touch on that.
Yeah, so obviously we have heard all of this as well. So when Rami Khouri and I were planning this webinar series, it was actually a webinar series, not a single conference, which gave us time to kind of plan it in the weeks in between each of the sessions. And the webinar series ran in May. So the last webinar in the series was with Dr. Azam Tamimi, who is London-based, a very, you know, senior and respected expert on the relationship between traditional Muslim shura kind of consultative councils and democratic practice, and fairly close to the Hamas leadership, I should say, and some of the people who founded Hamas, who have obviously since been assassinated by Israel. So we asked him explicitly about the 1988 charter, and he gave us a couple of very interesting responses. Now, the thing is, there is another document that isn't called a charter as such. I forget what its exact name is, but we include both of these very foundational documents in our book. And it's important, I think, to note for people that our book contains not just the records of our 5 webinar sessions, but also 6 really important and informative appendices. One of them is excerpts from the 1988 Covenant, and another is excerpts from Hamas's 2017 Document of General Principles and Policies. So the 2017 document is extremely different from the 1988 charter, and it goes to pains to say, to differentiate between Judaism as a respected religion and Zionism as a settler colonial project, and to explain how the Palestinian history has always included Muslims, Jews, and Christians, and so on and so forth. So definitely worth reading the 2017 document. Now, the question is, has that replaced and superseded the 1988 charter? And there is a little bit of fuzziness on this issue, because my understanding is, and I don't think I got this primarily from Azam Tamimi, but from talking to other people, that the Shura Council, the National Shura Council, decision-making body of Hamas, deliberated over a period of time on the exact wording of the 2017 document, but they didn't want to completely throw away the 1988 charter until they have something in return, if you like, because one of their big criticisms of the PLO and Fatah is that the PLO and Fatah jumped through all the hoops that the West demanded, renouncing terrorism, recognizing the state of Israel, blah, 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 without getting anything concrete in return, but only some vague promises, which, as we know, were not fulfilled. Like, there was a promise that there would be a final status peace agreement between, this was stated in Oslo, between Israel and the PLO. There would be a final status peace agreement by May of 1999, and that has never happened. And that was largely what led to the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the year 2000. So it's the question of the relationship between these two documents, the 1988 document. What Dr. Azam Tamimi told us was that at that time, most of the leaders of Hamas who were in Palestine were in jail, because it was the height of the First Intifada. And so the 1988 covenant was written by some random school teacher somewhere. The way he described it, it didn't have the whole process of the Shura Council consultation. But once it was there, it was hard to set it aside, but it was largely superseded by the 2017 document, and the 2017 document also opens the way to provisional acceptance of a 2-state solution. So it's a very important document, and I think people should read it.
Thank you for that. I have just a comment for Andreas Katsaros. He asked about the Arab population with Israel. I just wanted to let you all know that we literally today have just added a new webinar that we will be having on the 4th of December with a scholar called Ter Abu Ras, and it's called The Palestinians of Israel, the Historical Development from 1948 to Present. So we'll cover those issues there. So hopefully you can come along and join us. We will be sending out emails about that. Like I said, it was literally just confirmed while this webinar was happening. So I'm happy to announce that that will be happening and that will be going ahead. I've got a question from Sandra Hamrouni. She's a former Balfour Project trustee. She says, by the way, I'm halfway through your book and it's fabulous, both in content and approach. Thank you. She asks, why do the UK, US, EU still prescribe Hamas a terrorist organization as they did the ANC for years? Is this purely because of their support for Israel, or is it because they think Hamas would negatively impact on their vested interests in the region? Do these Western powers believe that the current right-wing supremacist government will be contained more easily than Hamas? What do you think it is?
Oh boy, that's a huge question. You know, I can speak best maybe to the motivations of our government here in Washington, D.C. I grew up in England during that era of decolonization that I think Tim grew up in the same era. But now I've been here for more than 40 years. And I'm more familiar with like what happens in this government. And there is an ongoing discussion, debate as to whether the US government is the head of the snake and Israel is its Rottweiler. We're really mixing metaphors here, but you see what I mean. Or whether it's Israel that calls the shots and the US government, for whatever reason, has been kind of subordinated to Israeli Zionist, expansionist, militarist preferences. And I think, you know, what I've seen here over the 40 plus years that I've lived here and worked here and studied the system is the deep embedding of Zionist ideas and ideology into society at all levels here. When I first came, you know, in 1982, and we were watching the bombing of Beirut, you know, there were liberal Republicans in this country, like Paul Finley and others, who were deeply opposed. And even Ronald Reagan, who was president, picked up the phone and told Begin, you know, of course, Reagan was not a liberal Republican, but he was a Republican. And he picked up the phone and told Begin, you know, what I am seeing in Beirut is a Holocaust, and you've got to stop. And at that time, the people that supported Israel was the Democratic Party and the left, and that's completely flipped since then. Now, well, not completely flipped. I mean, you still have this like deep embedded residue of pro-Zionist interests, links, funding, and all the rest in the Democratic Party, but now it's also in the Republican Party. There is no such thing as a liberal Republican anymore in this country. And meantime, at the grassroots in the Democratic Party, you've had this rise of support for the Palestinian movement, but it's only at the grassroots. It's not at the level of the leadership of the party, and it's actually a really divisive force within the party. And maybe, you know, in 2 weeks' time, we will see that this has the insistence of Kamala Harris on continuing to support the genocide in Gaza with only the tiniest bleeps of like, oh, I'm a bit concerned about Palestinians, but no policy, anything, that may cost her the election. So it's huge in this country and huge for the world, I think.
Oh, that's a very grim thought because of the alternative. We've got a couple of questions I'm going to combine. But a comment from Peter Rundle, a really helpful and nuanced discussion for which thanks. He asks about the role of Iran. James Gavin asks about Qatar's relationship with Hamas, and Vina Stevenson asks about China's relationship with various Palestinian groups. So there you go. Iran,
Okay.
Qatar, and China. Discuss.
Okay. Well, each of them is a separate and really interesting topic. So I'll start with Qatar, because Qatar historically has had close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, and those have transferred over into its relationship with Hamas. But at the same time, Qatar hosts the biggest American military base anywhere in the region. So go figure. I mean, you know, Qatar's internal decision making is a black box that I really don't want to get into, but they have played an important role as the intermediary in the indirect ceasefire negotiations, and for several years now, sending money into Gaza to help prop up and even expand the Gaza civil administration under Hamas, at the urging of the Israelis, it needs to be noted, because the Israelis were eager to build up Hamas-run Qatar as a counter to the PA in Ramallah and play the traditional divide and rule, you know, game that empires play. So that's Qatar. Iran. Now, You know, prior to the civil war in Syria, there was a very rich relationship between Hezbollah and Hamas. And that relationship was first born in 1994 when Prime Minister Rabin deported 400 Palestinian leaders from Gaza and the West Bank, including many Hamas leaders. And he tried to deport them to Lebanon. Lebanon wouldn't accept them. And the only people in Lebanon who would help them were Hezbollah, which sent down, you know, food packages and medical supplies, but also a lot of military experts to teach military techniques to these indigenous Palestinian leaders who found themselves on the border in South Lebanon. And then Rabin was forced to take them back, to let them back into their home communities, and they took back with them a lot of the military technology and techniques that they had learned from Hezbollah. So those relationships were very important, and they were severed to a large extent when the Syrian civil war broke out, with a huge amount of Western intervention in Syria, trying to undermine and overthrow the government in Syria. So Hezbollah went to help the government in Syria, and Hamas, until then, Hamas's leaders had been in Damascus. That's where I did a lot of my own interviewing with Hamas leaders over the years, was in Damascus, but in about 2011, 2012, they had to leave Damascus. And that's when they went to Qatar. So one of the things that happened last year, prior to October 7th, was, and here we come to China. China succeeded in starting a very important reconciliation process between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has started to end that sort of Shiite versus Sunni, Arabs versus Iranians divide and rule that the West had promulgated and pursued since, for a long time, but specifically since the civil war in Syria. So the Chinese did play a role in easing those tensions, and as a result, indirectly, that helped to ease tensions between Hamas and Iran. Although Hamas has always had, you know, a representative in Iran, even throughout the whole of the Shiite-Sunni split. So there was China playing an important role. China is also trying to work on unifying the Palestinian national leadership. And I think it was in August of this year, they convened a very important conference in Beijing when the leaders of 14 Palestinian factions all got together under the sponsorship of the foreign ministry. It didn't work in terms of reunifying the Palestinian movement, but I would assume that the Chinese efforts and efforts of other parties to bring about that unification are continuing.
Thank you so much. We had a question from Ria Cabus. You mentioned the Christian community. So Ria wondered if you could give a bit more information about their relationship with Hamas.
Yeah, let me think. You know, I've had so many discussions with Hamas leaders and at all levels, you know, from the top leadership to the grassroots. And they have always expressed, you know, great support for Christians in the Palestinian community. This is one of the many ways in which Hamas is very different from ISIS, and it's really worth underlining that, because this, you know, Hamas is the same as ISIS meme is very, very common in Western discourse. And in our book, we actually go through in, I think, chapter 2 with Dr. Khaled Haroub, many of the ways in which Hamas is very different from ISIS. I mentioned earlier, you know, its support of women's education, women's progress in the professions at all levels. women's support. I mean, the Hamas women who ran for and won parliamentary seats in the 2006 election. So Hamas's relationship with Christians is another way in which it's very different from ISIS. If we recall how the ISIS and Al-Qaeda oppositionists in Syria treated the local Christian communities there. I think it's also important and interesting to note that obviously my co-pilot on this whole project was Rami G, Khouri, who, you know, the word Khouri means priest, and Rami does come from a, you know, respected Palestinian Christian family in Nazareth, well-known hotbed of Christianity in its early years, one might say. So one of the things that he has said a number of times, you know, I've never asked him, like, if there's a Palestinian election tomorrow, who would you vote for? Because that's not my right to ask him. But he does say that in his view, Hamas is the movement that best represents the interests and priorities of the whole Palestinian national movement at this point. So, you know, I think he's far from the only Palestinian Christian who would make that assessment. So yeah, I think that those points are important.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up soon, so I wanted to give you one comment from Heather Formani. This webinar needs to go out to everyone. It's hugely important. 1,000 thanks. So that's my opportunity to tell everyone that this will be going out on our mailing list as well soon. It will be on our website, it'll be on YouTube, and you can also catch all of our webinars, including this one, on whatever podcast platform you use to listen to your podcast. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google. Oh no, I don't think Google Cast exists anymore, but wherever you listen to your podcasts. So please do share it with anyone that you think would benefit from listening to this. I agree, very, very important webinar, and thank you so much, Helena, and also Tim, for it. As you all know, we do these webinars for free. We've got on average about 2 a month now on a range of different topics to do with Israel-Palestine. So please do keep on sharing. But we would very much appreciate any donations, especially if you would consider becoming a friend of the Balfour Project, which means signing up to give any regular amount, any monthly amount, and then you will become a friend of the Balfour Project, which entitles you to free or discounted tickets to our paid events, also quarterly meetings with key people within the Balfour Project in order to give feedback, as well as to learn about the inner workings of the Balfour Project and so forth. I have posted the links in the chat box, but I will also be including them in the email that will go out with the recording for all of Helena's writings, where you can buy her book and so forth, as well as some other interesting recordings that she shared with me. So I'm going to end on one last question, unless Tim also wants to follow up with any more questions. And this comes from Graham Ogden, and you did say that you are more a specialist of relations with the US government. So I'm going to tweak his question a bit. How can we influence our governments to redefine Hamas so that the terrorism laws and labels are not used against this dialogue with Hamas and journalists who are, so that journalists are not targeted anymore for reporting on Hamas, which has been the case recently as well?
So maybe Tim should answer this, I don't know, but my impression is that the anti-terrorism legislation in the UK is actually far more draconian at this point than it is in this country, where we have, thank God, something called the First Amendment, which gives us, you know, the right to freedom of speech and association. And I've been just, you know, really upset to see the actions taken against journalists like Asa Winstanley or Craig Murray, or people who are working really hard and have long distinguished histories as, you know, evidence-based reporters and analysts, the actions being taken against them by your government. In this country, there is obviously a lot of fear about federal speech suppression and speech suppression by universities and other institutions. So I'll leave it to Tim mainly to talk about the UK, but for me, it's very anomalous that our government has been like spearheading or presenting itself. You know, Antony Blinken is right there right now on his 11th tour, you know, to try to nail down a ceasefire. And we know that that is a ceasefire that involves Hamas. We know that, you know, if there is to be a ceasefire, it will be an indirect negotiation with Hamas. So he wants to do that while he wants the citizenry to like not talk about Hamas. I mean, it's a very like repressive and patronizing view of civil society. So Tim,
You want to add to?
Oh, well, I mean, I think the situation here as regards the journalists, which is my speciality, is absolutely appalling. It's never been worse. I mean, we've seen four, Helena mentioned two of them, avid and informed journalists and Palestinian commentators raided at dawn as if they were some kind of suspected bombers, equipment taken away, arrests made in some cases. In other cases, in Asa's case, no charge laid, but this might as well have done. They've taken away his ability to function as a journalist. The thing that troubles me beyond what Helena has pointed out is of course that the mainstream press here, the mainstream media, including the BBC, makes absolutely no mention of it. And we have to ask ourselves, you know, if they're knocking on the door of the freelancers now who are vulnerable, how long is it before they're knocking on the doors of the mainstream newspapers, or more sinister, in a more sinister sense, as I think, they've knocked on those doors already. And in many cases, the mainstream media either are sympathetic to Israel anyway, for some reason that's beyond me, or, as in the case of the more worthwhile organizations like the BBC and The Guardian, they have been intimidated. I don't say that the BBC...
And you have D-notices there. I mean, here we have less formal ways of
These are worse than D-notices. The D-notices are advisories, and I don't think they play much of a part anymore. What happens now is this is sheer intimidation by the police, by the arm of our law. And if the government isn't dictating it, it's certainly agreeing to it. I mean, maybe it's coming from inside the Home Office, inside the anti-terrorist squad, inside MI5. I wouldn't be surprised. But, you know, everybody's going along with it, and including the BBC, which is good in parts. The BBC does some good things. I won't hear of it described as a state organization, but in many ways, it is intimidated by the Zionist lobby, by its need to, need to keep in with the government, which enables its funds, enables the license fee. All these things are pressures which are brought viciously to bear. And I think it means that in this country, the only way you can find out what's happening in Palestine, basically, is to go online and to view Al Jazeera and to view the many, many brilliant websites that are in service at the moment, talking about the realities of Israel and Palestine. And not all of them yet have been closed down by the spooks. But, you know, we worry about it because intimidation here is very, very strong, and people are fearful. You can't get people to speak at seminars. You can't get people to talk at universities, at conferences. You know, people are staying in the shadows. They're worried.
So thank you, Tim, for that. And thank you to the Balfour Project for helping us to open up what we call the Overton window, you know, like the space within which reasoned discussion, fact-based discussion of these issues can be held. So, you know, our solidarity to you guys there in the UK, and you know, we're trying to do it here, mainly in the US.
Well, thank you, Helena. You've been brilliant. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank everyone who has attended today. We had very, very high attendance. We knew we would because this is such a fascinating topic. Helena, thank you so much, and Tim as well for joining us and for just being absolutely phenomenal and answering as all the questions that you managed. You've got loads of comments coming in telling you thank you and that it was very interesting and so forth. I will be sharing all of those comments with this, both speakers, so they will be able to see the comments. They've obviously been focused.
And people should buy the book, yeah?
Yes.
Dan has recommended it. So yes, it's like I said, the links, I share them in the chat box, but they will be in the email that is going to go out this evening as well with the recording. So do share the recording with as many people as you can and buy Helena's book. So on that note, I will say goodnight to our speakers and all of our attendees. Thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you. Good night.